Hi everybody, this is Ted. Welcome to our week 8 video discussion. So last week we moved away from our overarching narrative towards a different educational perspective. We went from viewing education as a public good, which is essential for democracy and social cohesion, to viewing it as a private good or a commodity for individual advancement. We saw some of the arguments made in favor of a private good through our authors last week, like Smith's critique of bureaucratic inefficiency, Friedman's voucher system, and Brian Kaplan's pretty radical signaling model, which argues that essentially we're spending years in school not primarily to learn, but just to prove we're the kind of person worth hiring. So this week we're going to delve a little deeper into this signaling phenomenon, but we're taking an approach from a sociological perspective rather than sort of the economic one that Brian Kaplan was. And by doing that, we're really going to be looking at a particular ideology that often exists unexamined in our popular consciousness in the US, and that would be meritocracy. So, before we critique this idea, I think it's really important that we take a second to define it. So, what is meritocracy? At its core, meritocracy is the idea that social and economic rewards should be distributed based on individual merit. That's typically understood as a combination of talent and effort. In a perfect meritocracy, your success is not going to be determined by who your parents are, your race, your gender, or your wealth, but by your own abilities and how hard you work to develop them. It's really the opposite of the idea of like a hereditary aristocracy or a system based on nepotism. So you don't have leadership getting passed down, by kings to their kids. It's supposed to be about whoever is the best at the job gets the position, which, makes a lot of sense in one respect. So I would say this idea is pretty powerful in our modern society, especially in the US. It sort of forms the basis of what I think a lot of us consider to be the American dream, which is the belief that anybody from any background can make it, quote unquote, if they try hard enough. And it promises that inequality is fair because those at the top earned their place and those at the bottom had an equal chance to rise. And that's something you'll hear about often. Especially if you're listening to the news, you hear people talking about opportunity. You can kind of see that's maybe one of those buzzwords that's oftentimes referencing sort of a meritocratic belief. So this is where I think education also is going to be really critical, because people talk about opportunity in education. In a meritocratic society, the education system is positioned as the primary engine of mobility and the impartial judge of merit. You guys might recall already earlier in class we kind of had some reference to Horace Mann's discussion of education as the balance wheel. Basically functioning as sort of the great leveler for societies. It'd be the institution that's supposed to identify talent from all backgrounds, no matter who it is, and cultivate it, and then after that, it's supposed to certify it with degrees and diplomas. So your educational credentials are supposed to become the proof of your merit or your value, you could say, which is then supposed to determine your access to high-paying jobs and social status. So you can already kind of see how there might be some issues with this, especially if we're thinking about what Bryan Caplan's argument was. It's a pretty optimistic narrative, I think, in some cases, to think that all of this is going to play out completely fairly. So I think when we look at the system a little bit more closely, you're going to start to see some issues. And that's exactly what Sandel, Bourdieu, and Thelin have to say. So let's start off with Sandel, who has sort of the biggest reading this week. Michael Sandel is a philosopher, but in his work, he is delivering a really powerful critique of the meritocratic ideal. He argues that rather than creating a fair and mobile society, our meritocratic system actually has ended up becoming sort of a form of tyranny. He traces the origins of this system to what he calls, at least in the U.S., a meritocratic coup d'etat led by the president of Harvard in the mid-20th century. His name was James Conant. He basically wanted to dismantle the old hereditary aristocracy of wealth and replace it with a new, smarter, more capable elite class identified through tools like IQ and the SAT. And I think we can even make the argument, based on some of the readings that we've done, that this idea goes even further back with, as I mentioned, Horace Mann, but even Thomas Jefferson, although his definition of who should be able to rise, is maybe a little bit narrow. But I think we can see that at least Sandel says that this project has had a couple of devastating consequences. First of all, it legitimizes inequality. And from Sandel's perspective, this is not the best outcome for society. He says basically a mobile society is not necessarily an equal one. And Conant wasn't necessarily looking for an equal distribution of wealth. All he was interested in was letting people sort of swap places along the social ladder. But Sandel says this hasn't even happened. Instead, we have a system that basically just says your place in life is earned. If you're on top, you deserve it. If you're on bottom, you deserve that too. And Sandel says all this basically does is just make inequality seem fair and justified. And it sort of saps the political will of people to want to address it. Basically, if people think that failing basically is their own fault, and so they don't know what to do. Second point Sandel makes is that meritocracy creates a toxic sorting culture. And in this, the education system really becomes a sort of brutal sorting machine. And this is Caplan's point too. He's taking the perspective of an economist and an advocate of a private good when he argues that it's creating a wasteful system. But he still says it makes sense for us to participate because there are these real rewards at the end. Sandel here is pointing to the rise of credentialism, which is, something that Kaplan notes too. But Sandel's saying there's an issue here because credentialism, in his words, is the last acceptable form of prejudice. And it's basically a prejudice against those without a college degree. And he shows basically how political discourse has been reshaped around the axis of smart versus dumb, rather than questions about justice, like, is this just or unjust that we're doing this? Is this fair or unfair? Sandel says this is pretty demoralizing for a lot of people in the U.S. Who don't have a 4-year degree, whether they chose not to pursue school or maybe they couldn't even afford it. But it's not just damaging for the people who couldn't get a degree. Sandel argues it's also damaging for people who do get a degree, the winners, quote unquote. He calls these people, the people who go through the education system and win, potentially can end up injured or wounded. Students from affluent backgrounds who are pushed through a soul-crushing sort of childhood gauntlet of AP courses, tutors, and extracurriculars that can lead to sort of epidemic levels of anxiety, depression, and perfectionism. This sort of mental health crisis around these things. And these students often arrive at elite colleges not curious or interested in learning even, but in some ways they're, as he says, dazed survivors of a bewildering lifelong boot camp, basically designed to get them there. Sandel's final point is that this system, meritocracy, that is, corrodes solidarity, which is basically our shared understanding of community and that we're all in this together, basically our shared fate. He says that meritocracy tells the successful that they're self-made and they deserve all their success, and it tells those who are left behind that they have nobody to blame. And he thinks that this fuels a lot of resentment and the political polarization that has kind of worked to contribute to the divisions that we have sort of in the U.S. recently. I believe he was writing this book in 2020 or so. So this is a pretty recent book. So if Sandel gives us the sort of macro level critique of the meritocratic ideal, sociologist Pierre Bourdieu gives us the micro level tools to understand how privilege is actually reproduced within a supposedly fair system. He argues that economic capital, which is basically money, is only one form of power. And Bourdieu believes that just as important are these other forms of power, which are cultural capital and social capital. Cultural capital is the sort of collection of knowledge, skills, education, taste, mannerisms that somebody acquires from their family and their social class. It can exist in the embodied state, which is basically how you speak, your accent, how you look. An objectified state, which is sort of things that you have personally, like books, art, a car maybe, and crucially, an institutionalized state, which is, for our purposes, I think it's most important, is the educational credential can be one. So why is this so powerful? Bourdieu says the school system, which pretends to be neutral, implicitly rewards cultural capital that belongs to the dominant class. And that is going to be the most successful people usually. So highest people on the the social ladder, richest people usually. And so a child from a professional family arriving at school, if their family is made up of two doctors, the kid is already going to be familiar with the language and behaviors that the educational system values. Their native ability is often just seen as sort of natural, but in many cases it's the product of basically an early invisible investment that the family has made in the kid. And as Bourdieu puts it, cultural capital basically manages to combine the prestige of innate property with the merits of its acquisition. And that is essentially basically saying that what you have, like Sandel said, you basically deserve. So let's talk quickly about social capital as well. So this is essentially this resources linked to your network of relationships. It's who you know. It's the old boys club or the alumni network and the connection that can get you an internship or recommendation. This is something that I think is often talked about when people are thinking about Harvard or Yale or sort of these Ivy League schools, or even, these more elite private boarding schools, that oftentimes one of the most important things is the sort of like connections that you'll make. Maybe you don't necessarily learn anymore, but you're going to be around people who have a lot of resources. So, if you become friends with somebody who's this kid of a CEO, maybe you're getting invited to fancy parties, or, you're going to be around people that can help launch your career. So I think the key insight that Bourdieu shares with us is that these forms of capital are convertible. Basically, wealthy families aren't just handing money to their kids. They're taking that money, the economic capital, and turning it into cultural capital by paying for things like elite schooling, tutors, and even travel, potentially, as well as social capital, which can come with some of the things that we've talked about, especially in an educational setting. The child is then going to be able to turn their social capital or cultural capital back into economic capital by landing a high-paying job. That's what Bourdieu says. And so this all works sort of as a hidden form of hereditary transmission, or sort of almost like a laundering, if you want to get really conspiratorial, like money laundering scheme. But, it's not, I wouldn't say it has that sort of like dark intent necessarily, but it's just what people are trying to do. They're trying to set their kids up for success. And I think that's one of the ways that we can sort of point to see how, people and their kids sort of maintain their position on the social ladder. And it's why meritocracy can often fail to deliver true mobility. So finally, we'll talk briefly about John Thelin's analysis of the 2019 Varsity Blues scandal, which I think is really a perfect case study to illustrate some of these theories. Thelin makes a crucial distinction between the illegalities of the scandal, which are basically the outright bribery of standardized testing officials and admissions officers, as well as the hiring of some to take the admissions test in the place of a student, with the inequities of the standard admission system that we actually do have. And the real scandal, Thelin says, is that the perfectly legal system still provides plenty of advantages for the sort of wealthy, is like a lot of Hollywood actors even, to be able to sort of take advantage of this stuff for their kids. And the main sort of gist of the article was that Thelin talks about how country club sports, which are basically like crew, sailing, water polo, sort of like country club kind of things, can basically be used as a mechanism for privilege. These are really sports that require very expensive equipment and lots of coaching, and so it really makes them mostly accessible to those who are primarily the affluent. And Thelin points out that at elite liberal arts colleges, varsity athletes can constitute between 30 and 40% of the student body, and most of them are carefully recruited. So when you combine this with the preference for legacies, which are children of the alumni of the school that already have gone to the school, and children of sort of wealthy philanthropy donors, somebody who buys a building, or, they get their name put on a library, it's pretty hard for the school to turn them down. And with all of that combined, you have a very powerful affirmative action for the rich, is what Thelin says, which operates in a very completely legal framework. And this creates what Thelin calls an embarrassment of riches, which is essentially the critical mass of privileged, talented students whose achievements are then compounded by already sort of immense advantage. The opportunity, or the system, isn't really just failing to be a true meritocracy in Thelin's in Thelin's view. It's really already functioning as a mechanism for the intergenerational reproduction of the elite, which is essentially what Bourdieu is also saying. So let's take a second to synthesize and summarize all these readings. I think the sociological challenge that Sandel, Bourdieu, and Thelin present to us is really a direct confrontation with our meritocratic ideal in this country. Sandel shows that the society's sorting system basically legitimizes inequality, and even if it was working, he says it still fosters a pretty toxic and divisive culture. Bourdieu is sort of pulling the curtain back, so to speak, on some of the hidden rules of the game through his concepts of cultural and social capital. And he basically says, hey, this competition is basically rigged from the start. Thelin provides the evidence for some of what Sandel and Bourdieu are saying with his analysis of the Varsity Blues scandal. And he demonstrates essentially how advantage for the wealthy is already legally embedded or permitted in our system. So I think altogether they're really forcing us to ask, has the idea, the project of using education for social mobility created a society that makes us more unequal and not less? Have we created a fundamentally unkind society that is undermining the mutual respect and solidarity that a healthy democracy, I would say, probably needs? So just some things for us to think about. Next week we will be talking about class a little bit more. This week we're sort of talking about some things tangentially related, but we'll be looking specifically about through the lens of social class next week. So thanks, guys, for listening. Hope this was helpful. Bye.